Hello everyone, Phil here from the Blue Envelope channel. In this video today, I was going to talk a little bit about the religious history in the area I spent most of my life, which is Western New York. And it's kind of a notable area. There was a lot of action over the decades in that area for some reason. And so I thought I'd kind of talk about that a little bit and then weave in, personal experience that I ran into from living in that area for so many years. So what I'll do, I think, is just talk briefly about kind of an overview of religious activity in the US and particularly in Western New York there, and then kind of zero in onto witnesses more. So the time period that's probably most interesting for people interested in the witnesses is called the Second Great Awakening. And so just to give some context, the First Great Awakening was in the early 1700s. So America was formed with the 13 colonies, not to go too far back. And a lot of the people that came to America were pretty religious, and there was Protestants as well as Catholics. And then so religiosity, is that the word, kind of waned over the years. And then so by the early 1700s, there was interest in reviving the religious activity more and getting more emphasis back onto that. And so this was this period of the First Great Awakening. And so there was kind of this revival in religious things, interest in that sort of thing. And so that's where we get that term, revival. And so they were events that were held here and there. There was a little more emphasis on the emotional aspect of religion, feeling the Holy Ghost and getting, kind of whipped up into more of a religious fervor, and emphasis on, hellfire. And so it's kind of that two-edged thing of one thing increasing the joy and excitement of religion, and then also increasing the fear of going to hell. And so it kind of worked from both ends to get people more religious. Around that time, you saw more schisms emerge in the different Protestant denominations that were in the colonies. And so in particular, the Baptist religion and the Methodist religion both kind of emerged in this time period of the First Great Awakening. So that was a real religious period, and then the American Revolution happened, and then it kind of waned again. And so by the time of the early 1800s is when this Second Great Awakening took off. And so now we're talking the period 1800s up to around the Civil War time. So those few decades. And again, there was this interest in people had gotten less religious, and they needed to get back to that. So again, we saw this wave of interest in holding religious revivals, and there was particularly more interest in the idea of millennialism, which is that Jesus would be returning, and he would, he would start his 1,000-year reign that the Bible talks about. And so there was a lot of interest in this return. They called it the Advent of Christ. So Adventism was a big thing, and particularly a lot of religious folks were trying to figure out, could they tell the date that Christ would be returning. So that was the Second Great Awakening. And then, so some people talk about a Third Great Awakening after the Civil War. And then some people say, no, it's more just a return or a continuation of the Second Great Awakening. But either way, talking about that time period after the Civil War, the second half of the 19th century. So zeroing in on the Second Great Awakening time period, basically the 19th century, we saw a lot of new religions emerge in this time period. So just going kind of chronologically, around 1830 is when the Mormons started, the Latter-day Saints. And that started in Palmyra, New York, which is a little outside of Rochester. Around 1863 is when the Seventh-day Adventist religion kind of officially started. Ellen White was a major player in that, and that kind of formulated in Battle Creek, Michigan. In 1865, we saw the Salvation Army was created. That was actually in London. And then in 1880 was when the Salvation Army arrived to America. In 1875, the Christian Science religion was officially started. So that was the year Mary Baker Eddy published her book, Science and Health. And then in 1879, the church was formally established. That was in Massachusetts. And then, as we know, also in 1879, the Bible students were formed in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So zeroing in now a little bit more on the Western New York area, this was an area that got the name eventually the Burned Over District. And it sort of got that name because there were so many traveling ministers crisscrossing that part of the country. And they just kind of ate up or absorbed all the religious fervor until people got kind of, there was nothing left to give to all the different ministers, and they got burned out. So there were these, like I said, traveling ministers. They were called circuit riders, and so they didn't have one church that they were the pastor or minister of, but they would travel on horseback, and they would have the circuit that they were sent out by their governing body of the whatever denomination, and they would go from one church to another and kind of serve as the minister while they were there. So those were the circuit riders. I think that's probably where the term circuit overseer comes from that Jehovah's Witnesses use today, that same idea of traveling ministers from one congregation to another. So as I mentioned, it was around in the late 1820s, that the Mormon religion started. So Joseph Smith, who founded the religion, he lived in Palmyra at that point, which is a little outside of Rochester, New York. And yeah, that's where it started. That's where he said he started having, or where he was having major visions. And there was a particular hill out in Palmyra and that was the hill where he was directed by the angel Moroni to dig, and he found the golden plates, is what he said, that would become, and then he translated them to become the Book of Mormon. So yeah, Palmyra was really the birthplace of that, and you know, then in coming years, the whole Mormon group sort of kept moving further and further west until they got out to Salt Lake City, where their headquarters are today. But there's still some certainly remnants of that activity in Palmyra. In fact, in 1937, the church started the CUMORAH pageant out there. So Joseph Smith, he named that hill where he claimed to find the golden plates, he named that the Hill CUMORAH. So yeah, in 1937, the Mormons started this pageant, and it actually still goes on today every summer. So it's kind of at that spot. And basically, it's this huge play, or I guess kind of like a drama for witness terms, except kind of way amped up. So there's a 10-level stage that they do there. And I think they said about 700 actors in the play. And so basically for 1 week in the summertime, each night they do a production. So it goes for a couple hours there, and it's they kind of act out the story that happened there on the Hill CUMORAH of finding the golden plates, and then talk about what's in the Book of Mormon. And so it's like a soundtrack that's pre-recorded with music and words like witness dramas, and then all the actors acting out the thing. So it's a pretty big thing. You know, if you ever want to check it out, I think they get about 10,000 people each day that go to it there. Although actually I just found out that this year, 2020, is the last year they're putting it on. It sounded like just because it's a lot of work to put on this production every year, so they're winding it down. So yeah, if you want to check out the Hill CUMORAH pageant, this summer is the time to do it. Another group active in that area was the Shakers. So that was a smaller religious group, and they kind of believed in communes, having communal living. And so they had a commune in Sodus, New York, which is a little spot between Rochester and Syracuse. So that was called Alassa Farms. So yeah, that commune ran from 1826 to 1838. And then it sort of shut down. And it sounds like now it's an animal shelter there, which is cool. Yeah, so the Shakers were active there. Another group was the Fox sisters. So they initially lived outside of Rochester, and then they moved into the city. So these were three siblings, three sisters. From when they were girls, they started to profess to be getting messages from the spirit world. And so they became really famous in the US as spirit mediums, and they would hold seances. The idea is that the spirits would cause this rapping or tapping noise during the seance, and that was how they were communicating with the living. So they were, a big deal for several decades in the U.S. And then eventually in 1888, a couple of the sisters confessed that the whole thing was ruse, and they explained how they could cause the rapping noises by sort of cracking their joints and manipulating their tendons. That actually the whole thing was a fake thing. So yeah, that was right around Rochester. Continuing that spiritualism theme, because spiritualism, this idea of contact with the dead, got really popular in the second half of the 19th century there. And so in 1879, the town of Lilydale was formed, and that is a little south of Buffalo. So Lilydale is just a tiny little place. I think there's 275 residents there. A little town formed actually in 79. They're the same year that Russell started printing the WATCHTOWER magazine. And Lilydale is actually basically the center now of spiritualism in the US. So they hold the annual conferences are held there. And basically, so everybody that lives in Lilydale is a spirit medium. So that's the idea. So it's kind of a touristy thing too. You can go there and get your fortunes told and have a seance and that kind of thing. So it's popular in that regard. So Lilydale is so I was in the Jamestown congregation at that point, and then Lilydale's in the Dunkirk congregation's territory, the next one up. The interesting thing is that the witnesses do not enter Lilydale. It's in their territory, but it is forbidden territory. They never enter it to preach. So I guess it's like too much concentrated demonism in one spot, and the demons will get them if they if they enter the grounds. It's in a spot. It's the one border of Lilydale is right on the one highway we drive on a lot. It's sort of like it's a little overgrown on the borders, and every time we drive by, we just kind of look at you'd feel creepy. You could feel the demons leaking out of the the property there. Another group in the area is that there is Amish communities in kind of that western New York, northwest Pennsylvania area. We only had a couple Amish houses in our territory there, but the next congregation over, which was Conewango, there's a pretty sizable Amish population there. And so they were kind of experts on preaching to the Amish. So some of the friends knew the German dialect that was spoken there. Like when the brothers would go preach to the Amish houses, they would take their ties off because that was better. Witness women wouldn't talk to Amish men because that wasn't appropriate. So yeah, the Conewango witnesses, they tried really, really hard, but they never, ever, ever brought an Amish person to getting baptized as a witness. I knew of one Amish guy, a young guy over in Ohio, and he actually did leave the Amish and become a witness. So that was like famous in the whole area. But other than him, no Amish person in that whole tri-state area, Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York, never, ever, ever converted to be a witness. So another cool spot in the area was the Chautauqua Institution. So this is a little outside Jamestown, New York. It was created in 1874. So just to explain, Chautauqua is the name of the lake there. So what you would think is called Lake Chautauqua, but it's the opposite way around. So everybody says Chautauqua Lake, and it's Chautauqua County. It's supposed to be a Native American word that means bag tied in the middle. And that's kind of the shape of Chautauqua Lake from the air. And so, yeah, in 1874, Chautauqua Institution was set up. So that is a super cool place. Definitely visit it if you're ever in that area. But again, it's sort of like Lilydale. It's a small town or hamlet with defined borders. And it was set up as sort of a intellectual or cultural center. So all the houses there are really nicely maintained from that late 1800s era. So they're all really cool houses. And basically what they would do is every summer they would have programs there of learning. So there was a religious component to it. They would have different preachers and whatnot come in, but it wasn't any particular denomination. So that was one part of it. But then they would have, famous politicians come speak there. They would have musical performances. They would have classes there. So it's kind of an interesting idea. And actually, so they kind of say that was the mother Chautauqua. That was the original one. And in the next few decades after that, actually hundreds of daughter Chautauquas sprang up all over the country. So Chautauqua almost became like this generic noun. And same idea, they would have these cultural centers, and they all kind of died out, over time. I think there's one Chautauqua left still in Boulder, Colorado, but otherwise Chautauqua Institution is kind of the only one left. And it's really popular now. So how it works is there's an 8-week season in July and August. There's very few year-round residents that live inside Chautauqua. And actually, you have to be pretty well-to-do now to live there. Some of the witnesses that were contractors, they did work inside the institution. One of them said that the president of Xerox Corporation, which was from Rochester, he had his Easter house there. So it wasn't his summer house or his second house. It was his Easter house. So yeah, pretty rich people live in there. But a lot of people would kind of come for a week in the summertime, and you rent, an apartment or whatever, and then you kind of go to, and there's all day long. There's classes and talks and presentations that you can go to in the institution. There's a symphony orchestra there in the summer, and kids can attend, musical camps. There's a ballet company there in the summer. In fact, one of the ballet teachers was a witness. So her name was Glenda, and she's, I guess, a pretty well-known ballet teacher, and she was from Venezuela. So she would come up every summer for the 2 months and teach in the ballet company, and then she would attend the meetings. I was in the Spanish congregation at that point, and so she'd attend the meetings with us. And so she was pretty cool, very kind of cultural lady. And the idea, from what I understood, was she would kind of teach for those 2 months, and then she and her husband could live on that for the whole rest of the year down in Venezuela. So the institution has this cool thing called Palestine Park set up, and it's right on so Chautauqua is right on the lake itself there, and they have this sort of scale model of the Promised Land built there. So Chautauqua Lake stands in for the Mediterranean. And then there's a strip of land along the edge there, and that is Israel. That's the Promised Land. And it's sculpted and contoured, maybe like 300 or 400 feet long, and you can walk through it. So you can walk through, go from Jerusalem to the other cities, and there's little scale models of the cities there, and the Jordan River runs through the middle of it. And it's really cool. You have to pay to get in during the summer season, but every Sunday it was free. So at least once or twice every summer, a group of us would go up there and just walk around. It's really, really a cool place. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, millennialism was really popular in that Second Great Awakening, this idea of the second advent, the second coming of Christ. So the main player there in particular was a fellow named William Miller, who lived in Lowhampton, New York, which is way east, right on the border with Vermont. And he had done a lot of calculations which showed that Christ would return in either 1843 or 1844. And eventually he started, in the 10 or 15 years prior to then, he started really doing his own circuit, preaching through the whole area there. He would come up to Rochester to preach. In fact, in 1844, there was a group in Cobb's Hill in Rochester, which is a park now in the city, and the group was there waiting for Christ to return. Didn't happen, spoiler. Yeah, so after all those predictions failed, those couple of years, there was kind of this period called the Great Disappointment, where a lot of Adventists, you would say, didn't know what to think now. So one of them was, she was a teenage girl in that time period. Her name was Ellen White. So her whole family had become Millerites or Adventists, and they were disfellowshipped from their original church that they had belonged to. But after 1844, Ellen said that she started to have all these visions from God, from Jesus. And eventually she married her husband, James White, and he was an Adventist preacher. And they kind of continued. They started actually printing a magazine, which, that's one thing I'll mention. Everybody who wanted to back in that time period started their own magazine to preach their beliefs. So their magazine was, nowadays it's called the Adventist Review. It's actually a weekly magazine that comes out. But yeah, so they started printing it, talking about Ellen's visions and Adventist beliefs. So they were in Rochester around 1852, and they lived there a year or two. They had a printing press in their house, and they would print out this magazine. And then eventually they moved on to Battle Creek, Michigan, and that's kind of officially where the religion that they founded, which was Seventh-day Adventists, so they were Adventists, and then they gradually incorporated this view that some groups had that the Sabbath wasn't on Sunday, the first day of the week. It was on Saturday, the seventh day of the week. So that out of that eventually came this religion, Seventh-day Adventists. That was in the 1863. Now you might recognize that town of Battle Creek, Michigan, if you ever look at cereal boxes, because that's where Kellogg's cereal was Battle Creek. And so there were two Kellogg brothers, and they were both pretty hardcore Seventh-day Adventists. So they were very involved with the religion. In fact, that's actually where cornflakes was invented. Out of that was because the one Kellogg brother had a sanitarium there in Battle Creek, and so he would kind of treat people based on Seventh-day Adventist principles. And one of the principles was to really never get sexually aroused, to keep that really, really low. And one of the things they felt could help that was to eat bland food. And so he would feed the patients at the sanitarium all this bland food, and eventually they invented cornflakes because that fit in with that nice bland thing. And then later they invented Rice Krispies as well. So that's where that came from. Incidentally, that's one thing you kind of see this theme of no sex. So the one Kellogg brother, in fact, on his honeymoon, him and his wife spent their honeymoon writing this whole book about no sex and celibacy. So they were celibate. The Shakers were another group that believed in celibacy. Charles Russell and his wife Maria, the Bible students, they had a celibate marriage. I guess the one outlier was Joseph Smith with the Mormons. He went in the opposite direction, and he had, believed in polygamy and taking other men's wives, and so he was definitely the outlier there. But yeah, so that's where our Seventh-day Adventists came from, and they're actually it sounds like at least as big as Jehovah's Witnesses, if not bigger. They say about 20 million members worldwide, although I'm not sure, if they're counting exactly the same way as the Witnesses do. So another group that came out of that William Miller period was the Advent Christian Church. So they're much smaller. They have about 125,000 members worldwide, and they are what you would call first-day Adventists. So starting to zero in a little bit more on the Bible students now. So we've talked about William Miller was kind of the main player there. Now, a contemporary of his was another minister named George Storrs. So he was a Methodist preacher. He, like many, was also believed in all the 1844 Advent teachings of William Miller. A couple beliefs that he had that were kind of different. He believed that the soul was mortal, that the soul died, and he also believed in no hell. So those are beliefs familiar to witnesses today. So basically, one of his main things, he published a monthly Bible magazine from Brooklyn eventually, and that magazine was called the Bible Examiner. So he published that most of the years from 1843 up until he died in 1879. So he lived in Philadelphia for part of that time period. So Charles Russell he lived in Pittsburgh, but he traveled frequently to Philadelphia because of business. I assume he had some of his stores were in Philadelphia, although I'm not positive about that. So he would travel to Philly a lot, and then George Storrs would come to Pittsburgh for Bible studies with different folks out there. So they crossed paths frequently. So they were friends. In fact, I did see in one spot that George Storrs baptized Russell in 1874. I only saw that in one spot, so I'm not 100% sure on that. But they were definitely close friends. And so after Storrs died in 79 there, the Watchtower magazine, which had started earlier that year, they published a nice tribute to George Storrs. And in turn, the Bible Examiner magazine, which ended after Storrs died, ended publication. Its final issue was sort of a tribute issue to its founder, George. So they reprinted Russell's tribute from the Watchtower magazine. And so in the 1870s, before the Watchtower magazine started, Russell would publish articles in Storrs' magazine, the Bible Examiner. Now, another player in the Bible student story is Jonas Wendell. So he was an Adventist preacher right there in Pittsburgh. It was his sermon that Russell attended when he was 18 years old there. So that was in 1869. He went to a talk or a sermon by Wendell. Wendell at that point was kind of preaching a teaching that was getting to be pretty popular, which was that actually it wasn't 1844 that Christ was going to return, it was 1873. So Russell got really interested in that, and it kind of sparked his interest in the Bible. Now Wendell actually died in 1873, so it's kind of a funny how that worked. You know, he never got to see, he probably died assuming his teaching was true. And then another character in Pittsburgh was George Stetson. So he was another Adventist preacher there in Pittsburgh. And again, very close friends. He became close friends with Charles Russell. In fact, when Stetson died, he also died in 1879, and he had requested that Russell do his funeral talk. So Russell did that. And in fact, there was about 1,200 people that attended Stetson's funeral. And again, the Watchtower magazine had a tribute article about George Stetson after his death. So basically, after Russell met Jonas Wendell, there was this group, the 75 yearbook mentions on page 36, it says, soon this small group, about 6 in number, began meeting weekly for systematic Bible study. So there was George Storrs, George Stetson, Jonas Wendell, Charles Russell, Russell's dad, and then I'm not sure who the 6th person was, but basically they started having Bible study sessions together there, mainly in Pittsburgh. And that's kind of the very beginnings of the Bible student movement. Now, to bring it back to Rochester, we have to add another fellow named Nelson Barber. So Nelson Barber, he grew up in Western New York, and again, he was invested in the Millerite movement there. But after 1844, he kind of left in the great disappointment. And he kind of just went off. He went off to Australia and became a gold digger. He was an inventor. He invented some different things. He was involved in medical electrician, which was a job back then where you would use electricity to kind of heal people. But eventually, he also got kind of reinterested in Bible prophecy, Bible chronology. And so by 1870, he, like Jonas Wendell, was also advocating for 1873 as the year of Christ's return. And then when nothing happened in 73, he said, oh, actually, it was 74. So he was really focused on this year, 1874, for the second advent of Christ. And so in that year, he started publishing, just like everybody else, he started publishing his own magazine. It was called The Herald of Christ's Return. So that was out of Rochester. That was a monthly magazine he was putting out. He had a congregation up there. Now, 1874 came and went with no real action. So Barber had come up with this idea that, you know what, actually Jesus did return, but it was invisibly. It was in heaven that he came back. And so this idea of not a single event of Christ coming, but that Christ's presence was there, but invisibly. And so he began to disseminate that idea. And it's in December of 75 when Charles Russell read one of the issues of Herald of Christ's Return, and he read that idea of Christ's invisible presence. And that really helped to explain things, in Russell's mind, why nothing had happened. So he had Nelson Barber, he got in touch with him. He had Barber come down to speak in Philadelphia, and he attended a number of Barber sermons. And so what Barber was saying now at this point was that basically in 1878, April of 1878, that all the faithful ones that were then living would be raptured to heaven, and then Armageddon would come in 1914. So it was this kind of intermediate period before the actual Armageddon. And so that really clicked for Charles Russell. He was all in on that idea. And so in 1876, so now he's 24 years old here, he basically sold off with his father the clothing store chain. So they got about $300,000 for that, which is about $7 million in today's money. So a pretty good chunk of change. And really it was perfect because basically from his understanding, there were 2 years left on Earth. So that was a good amount of money to last 2 years. And he got really busy publishing this message of Christ's return in or this period that they were in, and especially in 1878, that the rapture would happen. So in Rochester, they really fired up the publishing operation that Nelson Barber had started. Now at this point, Barber had halted publishing the Herald of the Morning because basically he ran out of cash. His subscriber base had evaporated by that point. So with Russell's money, they were able to restart publishing each month the Herald of Christ's Return, that magazine. And then they also, each of them published a book in 1877. So Russell published a 64-page booklet called The Object and Manner of Our Lord's Return. And then Barber published a book he'd written called Three Worlds and the Harvest of This World. So the title, Three Worlds, he was referring to this idea that there were 3 ages, or they called them dispensations. So 3 ages in human history. And that can be seen in the chart that Russell would include with his studies in the scriptures books that he would go on to publish. So the idea is that the first world, or the first age, ran from the time of human creation up to the flood. The second world was from the flood to Armageddon. And then the third world, the third age, was the post-Armageddon period. And that was Christ had returned and he would rule for 1,000 years. It's kind of funny when you think about it that Adolf Hitler also had sort of his own version of this 3 worlds belief. So, except his focus more specifically on history in the country of Germany. So when we think about that term, the Third Reich, the word Reich means realm or empire. So he believed that there had been a first realm, and then a second realm, and then the Nazis were creating the Third Reich, the third realm. And he also believed that the third realm would last for 1,000 years, except that he seemed to believe more that like he was the Messiah, that he was in the Jesus position, and he would bring about that millennial reign. So at any rate, 1878 came, so April came and went, and there was no rapture. And so Nelson Barber got really embarrassed about promoting another failed prophecy. So this was kind of the second go around for him. He'd been there in 1844, now here 1878. So he got really disillusioned. Now Russell, this was still his first go around in failed prophecies. And what he came to believe was that instead of a rapture of everyone living in 1878, what had happened was that all the faithful that had died up to that point, they went to heaven. They got resurrected in the twinkling of an eye in 1878. And then that everybody that died after that, all the faithful ones, that's when they would instantly be taken to heaven with no waiting period. So still kind of it's a JW teaching today. Now Barber, he was kind of over everything. He didn't really buy that belief of more invisible events that nobody could prove or disprove. And so him and Russell got at loggerheads after that about not just that teaching, but pretty much every teaching. So pretty much every article that Russell would submit for the magazine, Barber would publish a critical or a counter article about whatever doctrine they were talking about. In particular, the society likes to focus on the ransom that they were disagreeing about. So their partnership kind of started to go down the tubes after 1878 there. And actually in April of 79, Barber started a new church of his own. It was called Church of the Strangers. So that was set up in Rochester. And then in May, that's when Russell officially pulled out of supporting the Herald magazine. And in July, he started publishing his own magazine, like everybody did back then. And he called it the Zion's Watchtower magazine. So here he is, 27 years old. He starts his own Bible magazine. And he kind of gave up on Rochester at that point, and his home base became Pittsburgh again for him. And that's where the Bible students started out. So it was pretty good timing, not only, so George Stetson died in 79, George Storrs died in 79. And so it was nice timing because the Bible Examiner magazine ended that year. And then Russell was able to start his magazine, the Watchtower. So it kind of took the place of that one. So that's a quick history of how the Bible students got started. Hopefully I didn't drone on too long about that. And so let me talk briefly about, I lived in the Rochester area till I was about, say 15. So what can I remember? Well, I was a pretty withdrawn kid in that time period. And so to be honest, most of the time before and after the meeting, you could find me holed up in the Kingdom Hall library, and I would tend to read old awake-bound volumes. But I remember a few interesting books that I ran across back then. One of them was a book that had been published of all the slides from the photodrama of creation. So I like to look through that. It had color, they were all colorized pictures in there, so that was kind of interesting. And Rochester was one of the cities where the photodrama was shown back in the day. I remember another interesting book was there was a set of studies in the scriptures there in the library. And I can remember checking out I think it was the first one, Divine Plan of the Ages. It had that chart that you could unfold from the beginning of the book that showed the three dispensations, the three ages, and it had like a pyramid diagram on it. So that was kind of intriguing to me, I remember. I remember another thing in the library, there was this kind of interesting panoramic pictures, like 24 by 6. It was a big black and white photo of one of the early Bible student conventions. So it was basically everybody that was at the convention was in the picture. So I used to like to look at that to see if I recognized anybody, which I don't think I did. I remember that between where our house was and where the Kingdom Hall in Irondequoit was, there's this pretty large Catholic property. So there was a Catholic church, there was a parochial school, and then the rectory was on the grounds there as well. And so as we drive by, 2 times a week, we'd always see they always seem to have these really expensive cars parked at the rectory, like brand new Cadillacs, it seemed like. And so we'd always kind of, shake our heads about the extravagance of the clergy there. The COs at that period, they were kind of all driving like Buick LeSabres, which were fine cars, but definitely not in the same league as a new Cadillac. That's why it kind of blew my mind when I first watched the Bottlegate video with Tony Morris, and he got into that white Cadillac. And I was like, what is going on? This is what we always criticized the Catholic priests for when I was little. And somebody did point out later that it was, it's a pretty old Cadillac. It's like a 2002, and it was worth maybe $2,000 or $3,000 at that point. So not as extravagant as I first thought. I actually kind of wonder because I think his mom died there in 2013. So I wonder if it was maybe his mom's car and then he just kind of inherited it after she died. I don't know. Here's a little photo from the December 2016 Watchtower, pages 3 through 7. This is some witnesses in Rochester, and they're advertising a talk here using the sandwich boards. Thinking back, another thing I remember from Rochester was we had a circuit overseer for a while named Bill Tracy, and he really sticks in my mind as an interesting fellow. So Bill Tracy, and then he had a brother named Bob Tracy, and they were both super spiritual guys. They'd both been through Gilead. So Bill Tracy, he went through Gilead and he was assigned to Guyana, and he eventually became the branch overseer there. And then his brother Bob Tracy, he went through Gilead and then he was sent to Columbia. So he became a CO, DO, branch overseer in Columbia. Then he became the zone overseer. And then eventually he was assigned to be branch coordinator in Mexico. Yeah, you can find Bob's life story and that of his wife. I think her name is Elizabeth. Both their life stories are in the Watchtower. Bill Tracy's mentioned. So Bill Tracy returned to the U.S. for some reason, and he was a CO there for many years. So he was married. His first wife died. And when I knew him, he had remarried to, I think her name was Linda Tracy. But it was kind of interesting to me because he was maybe 70-ish at that point, and Linda was maybe 40. She was much younger than he was. She had like this blonde curly hair. And they were both nice folks, but it was always kind of funny to see the two of them together with that age difference. But yeah, I can remember him being in our house, at lunch during his visits, and he would talk about the persecution that they'd had in the around 1940 time period. How they had to crawl out of town at night under fences and through ditches to escape the mob violence that was going on in that time period in the U.S. So that really fascinated me. I remember we had a congregation picnic one time, and so he came to that, and so we had a softball game, and he was the pitcher for both teams. So he was slow pitch the softball, I thought that was pretty cool as a little kid. So yeah, I was in the Rochester area till about 15, and then my family moved down to Jamestown, New York, which is sort of the southwest corner of the state. So I'll talk about that a little bit. Now, Jamestown, in many respects, is kind of a depressing place to live. It's one of those towns where the economy is depressed and, population is declining every year. Not too much going on there. One of its main claims to fame is that Lucille Ball was born and grew up in Jamestown area. She grew up in Celeron, which is a kind of, a little village at the edge of Jamestown. So yeah, when I lived there in 1996, they opened a comedy museum that is dedicated to Lucille Ball, which I never went to for some reason. I'm not sure why. In 2009, they built a Lucille Ball statue in a Celeron park, which was done and donated by a local artist. Unfortunately, as you can see, it was a really terrible sculpture that he did. It got the name eventually Scary Lucy. So it was there for a few years, and then somehow, I think around 2015, it got in the news for a hot minute. And so eventually the town erected a second statue, a much better Lucille Ball statue in 2016. But by that time, the scary one was sort of like a tourist attraction. And so I guess if you go there now, both statues are in the park. So that's kind of wild. So Jamestown definitely fits the mold of the burned over district in Western New York. It is super religious there. If you drive through the city, there are churches everywhere in Jamestown. And not just like on the main drags, but just embedded into neighborhoods. You just be driving through some houses and whoop, there's a church there. Jamestown is a very hilly city, and so there's spots where you can kind of go up on the hill and you just look over the city, and that's all you see are steeples sticking up all over the place. There was a Bethel couple that came back to town while I lived there, Tim and Lori Galster, and they came back to take care of Lori's parents who lived there. But Tim one time he told us that Bethel researchers have been doing some project, and anyways, they found that Jamestown had the highest density of churches to population, the highest ratio in the entire country. And we all just said, "Yep, that sounds about right." And so witnesses also fit in. Witnesses did really well in Jamestown because, again, it was a very religious area. The old timers love to talk about how originally the witnesses started out meeting in a rented room over a cake shop in downtown Jamestown, and they just kind of grew from there. Back in the 40s, Jamestown was a really happening place, and there was like crowds Friday night, Saturday night, and so the witnesses would go down to the center square, the center of town, and preach, and they did really well. Just to explain, Jamestown there were two dominant groups that migrated to Jamestown. So one group was Swedish and the other group was Italian. So the Swedish immigrants, they were all Protestant, basically, and then the Italians were all Catholic. So those were kind of the two main groups. Even when I was there in the 90s and 2000s, the two groups that you'd run into preaching. So I can remember there was one brother, Ralph Lawson, in our congregation, super friendly, older brother. And he had been a farmer basically his whole life. And so I think he was a witness during World War II, but he'd been exempted because he was running the family farm, so he didn't have to get drafted. And he was actually, I guess, pretty well known in the area back in the day. He was involved with cattle breeding, and he had kind of come up with some novel methods for cow insemination. So he was well known for that. But yeah, he'd tell us stories. There's lots of brick roads in Jamestown, and he would talk about one of his early jobs was driving a horse-drawn snowplow to plow the sidewalks in the wintertime. So yeah, so a lot of Swedish folks, tons of Lawsons and Johnsons and Swansons were in town there. And then lots of Italians as well. So, and they were all Roman Catholic, of course. So it was super hard for the witnesses to break into the Italian community and get the first converts to leave and become witnesses. That was like a huge battle. But once they were able to do that, so they got this first couple, they were named the Contis, which it should be pronounced Conti, but everybody said Conti there in Jamestown. So, but once they did that, then this like whole Conti dynasty started. And so, because they had like 4 or 5 kids, and then all the kids got married and had some kids. And so by the time I lived in Jamestown, there was just dozens and dozens of Contis and spread out through all the congregations there. And yeah, you couldn't throw a stone without hitting some Conti witnesses. But yeah, Jamestown was kind of a hub. In fact, the one Kingdom Hall that we went to, which was, I want to say from the 60s, it was a pretty old Kingdom Hall, but it had a baptism pool in the basement so that when assemblies were held in town there, that's where people could get baptized. It was just dry when I attended there, and I always thought, man, this would be great to have a hot tub in the Kingdom Hall basement. So when I was there, there was, I would say, roughly 300 witnesses in town, and the city had roughly 30,000 inhabitants. So it was a ratio of about 1 to 100, which when you look at the entire U.S. average, it was about twice the national average for witnesses elsewhere. And so again, it kind of fit into that really religious vibe. Now, I will say in the last 5 years, it has, like everywhere else, started to contract and consolidate. So one of the congregations was dissolved in 2018, 2019. So starting to see a little bit of change there. All right, guys. Well, there's a little more here to talk about than I had originally anticipated. So I think what I'll do is I'll break here and make this part 1, and then we'll pick it up again in part 2. Thanks for watching.